All right, well, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger. I'm the director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Michigan, and pleased to welcome you this afternoon to our Wiesnick Symposium on U.S.-Israel relations in the age of Trump. This symposium comes about, again, thanks to the donation of the Wiesnick family that supports an annual symposium of on a topic dealing with Israel. We decided this year to focus on the way that U.S.-Israeli relations have been changing since the election. As many of you know, tonight President Donald Trump will be delivering his first State of the Union address. And regardless of which side of the political aisle one stands on, I think we can all agree that the last year has been transformative in the United States, and particularly in terms of the United States' relationship with Israel. So we have brought to the Ann Arbor campus of the University of Michigan two outside experts who will be joining our own Mark Tesler in a discussion about the status of U.S. relations U.S. relations since Trump. So what we're going to do, I will first introduce the three speakers, and they will each speak on this general topic for about 10 minutes or so. And then I have a few questions that I will ask them as a moderator for about a half hour or so, maybe a little bit less, and then we're going to open it up to a discussion, to questions from the audience. So that's our plan, and hope it all goes as planned. So I'll actually first introduce the three speakers together, and then I'll have them each give their introductory remarks. So our first speaker will be Warren Bass. Warren, over there to my right, is executive editor of Penguin Press. He was previously a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal and an editor at the Washington Post. Warren served on the professional staff of the 9/11 Commission, where he was the lead investigator into national security issues and one of the writers and editors of the Commission's final landmark report. And he's here mostly because he's the author of the book Support Any Friend, Kennedy's Middle East and the Making of the U.S.-Israel Alliance. Our next speaker in order will be Mark Tesler. Mark is the Samuel Eldersveld Collegiate Professor of Political Science here at the University of Michigan, where he's also served as Vice Provost for International Affairs and Director of the university's International Institute. He's the author or co-author or editor of 15 books, including A History of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, and his most recent book is Islam and Politics in the Middle East, Explaining the Views of Ordinary Citizens. And our third speaker will be Mira Sukarov, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where she specializes in international relations and the politics of Israeli, Palestinian, and Jewish politics. She's also a very prolific op-ed writer and editorial writer. She's written in Haaretz, The Forward, The Globe and Mail, The Toronto Star, The Daily Beast, 972 Magazine, Canadian Jewish News, and elsewhere. She's the author of the international Self, Israel and the Search of Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and she's currently writing a book for the University of Toronto Press on op-ed writing. She also, by the way, has a very lively Facebook page. So I recommend being Facebook friends with her. You'll learn a lot about Israel-U.S. relations and the Middle East in general just from her Facebook page alone. I'd love to publish her. She should one day publish her collected Facebook posts as a book.
And I'd love more Facebook friends, most importantly, so thanks for the plug.
She's got a lot of them already. Always use more. All right, so again, each one will be speaking for about 10 minutes, then I'll ask some general questions, then we'll open up to the audience, and we'll begin with Warren.
Thank you. It's thanks to Jeff for bringing us all here. Can everyone more or less hear me? I defer to the boss. How's this? Nothing? There we go? Okay. All right, I will keep it right here.
Hang on, maybe we should. People seem to want us to use the podium. Is that what I'm hearing? I'm hearing let's use the podium.
The will of the people. So I'm going to come at this perhaps slightly differently from my colleagues. I am a recovering academic who has also worked at the State Department and in a few public policy jobs, and therefore we'll try to bring a bit of a practitioner view to some of these issues. But to start, it is, at this early stage, a little difficult to fully assess what the Trump administration means, not only on Israel-Palestinian issues or Israel-Iran issues, but just for the wider world. And in some sense, There are some things that look as if they've changed a great deal. There are other things that seem as if they haven't changed as much, which puts me in mind of this old Russian joke where there are these two friends who are out hiking one day, and one of their friends falls down into a hole. And his other friend rushes to the lip of the pit and shouts down, "Oh my God, are you all right?" And his friend from the hole shouts back up, "Yes, I'm fine." And his friend at the top of the hole shouts down, "Is anything broken?" And friend shouts back up from down there, "No, no, no, nothing's broken." And his friend at the top of the hole shouts down, "Well, can you start climbing back out?" And the friend in the hole says, "No, I'm still falling." This is roughly where I think we are in terms of understanding some of the consequences for this. Think whether you like the presidency, dislike the presidency. This is a state that voted for the president. This is not a campus that voted for the president. This is a significant departure, and it started occurring, and I will start on Twitter, as all good academic talks should start these days. On December 28th, 2016, in the last weeks of the Obama administration, when Trump was still president-elect, he tweeted, "The beginning of the end was the horrible Iran deal, and now this, UN. Stay strong, Israel. January 20th is fast approaching." So this was an attempt by the president-elect to scuttle a Security Council resolution on settlements that was advancing through the Council, which, as we now know from Wall Street Journal reporting in other places, had a series of incoming Trump transition officials who were calling for foreign counterparts and lobbying against it, an unusual way to get going even before being sworn in. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, retweeted the president-elect's tweet and said, "President-elect Trump, thank you for your warm friendship and your clear-cut support for Israel." So even before Trump was in office, he was maneuvering to put his stamp on U.S.-Israel relations. But he has been seized with these issues long beforehand. Here's a tweet from Citizen Trump on September 19th, 2011, as Palestinian negotiators were pushing to be recognized as a state by the UN General Assembly. And it's one of my particular favorites. The tweet is, "I'm increasingly concerned with the UN's ploy against Israel this coming week and will monitor all events closely from Australia." There's also another one of the weirdest moments in U.S.-Israel relations, which is on September 13th, 2012, in which Citizen Trump tweets out, "Wake up, America. See the attached article, quote, Israeli science, Obama birth certificate is a fake." This is not something I think Ben-Gurion really anticipated happening. The overall context for this strange moment of disruption is one of an unusual type of president who is broken in some significant senses with past bipartisan principles of American engagement in the planet held by both Republican and Democratic administrations. And how much you see the Trump administration's departure in terms of the U.S. relationship with Israel may have something to do with how much you think Trump and his administration are disrupting the wider global order and the U.S. role in it. And I will just note a few quick things that he has been trying to do just by way of context. On his third day in office, the president withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a 12-nation trade deal designed by the U.S. as a counterweight to a rising China. In his first week in office, he tried to ban travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries. He abandoned UN talks in migration. He said that he might renege on the Iran nuclear deal, a free trade agreement with South Korea, NAFTA. His proposal for the 2018 budget would cut foreign assistance by 42%, which works out to about $11.5 billion. He's proposed reducing U.S. contributions to the UN by 40%. He's pressured the UN General Assembly to cut $600 million from the UN peacekeeping budget. So this is a distinct change, and it's going on at a fluid moment in international politics. In 2000, the U.S. accounted for 31% of the global economy, and China accounted for 4% of the global economy. Today, the US share of the global economy is 24%, and China is up to 15%. So this is all unfolding in a world that is really changing, and there are certainly people in China who are watching this who are delighted. A prominent Chinese scholar who's well connected with the Chinese Politburo recently told Evan Osnos of The New Yorker, "I think Trump is America's Gorbachev." And in China, Gorbachev is the leader who led an empire to collapse. In the sphere of US-Israel relations, there are a few things that look quite familiar and a few things that look quite different. The things that look similar are that the fundamental military-to-military relationship and the ties between the security establishments in the US and Israel remain deeply strong, professional. They continue to work these issues on a deep and sustained basis. The president keeps up a stated willingness to back a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the caveat that the parties have got to want it, and you have to work out how meaningful you think that caveat is. President Trump does keep talking about the ultimate deal between Israelis and Palestinians. One of his envoys, Jason Greenblatt, who's a former real estate lawyer for the president, has been out in the region and has actually won pretty good marks from both sides for being quite serious, for listening, for meeting a variety of different communities. The Trump administration is retrying something that was tried under the Obama administration, which was to work from the outside in, to have Arab states who will offer various goodies and sweeteners and concessions to the Israelis in hopes of making the Israelis more tractable on the difficult decisions that have to be made with the West Bank and other issues dealing with the Palestinians. The U.S. continues to provide Israel with a lot of support, including a veto in the Security Council. So those are some things that are fairly similar. Some things that are different, and my colleagues and I may disagree slightly on these, but some things that are different are a significant swing to endorse at least some Israeli positions in the absence of any particular changes in the situation on the ground. There's a new comfort from the president on down with Arab autocrats, especially Sisi, the president of Egypt, who came to power after a coup that overthrew Egypt's first democratically elected president, who was from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Trump administration is also fascinated with the new Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, which is a big change from some of the tension that was there in the Obama administration. Human rights are virtually never mentioned in the readouts of conversations between senior U.S. officials and senior Arab autocrats. There is a distinct lack of presidential conviction about the necessity for a two-state solution. And most jarringly, there's been a presidential endorsement of Jerusalem as Israel's capital in the absence of ongoing final status talks, in the absence of a laid-out U.S. vision of what an endgame between Israelis and Palestinians would look like, and in the absence of compensatory language recognizing the legitimacy and importance of Palestinian claims, which is a big change from the past and bipartisan U.S. position that Jerusalem, as one of the core final status issues between Israelis and Palestinians, would have to be worked out to the mutual satisfaction, or this being the Middle East, the tolerable dissatisfaction of both parties. And that's very different. In Davos, the president said, "We took Jerusalem off the table so we don't have to talk about it anymore." I'm not completely convinced that's going to work. For now, the Palestinian leaders are refusing to meet with Jason Greenblatt or the somewhat closer to the Trump family envoy, Jared Kushner, since the announcement of the shift in U.S. position on Jerusalem. Kushner and Greenblatt seem to be trying to get word to the Palestinians that they should hang in there, and that when the U.S. comes out with some set of its current views about what a settlement to the conflict would look like, that there may be stuff in there that the Palestinians would like. We haven't seen that document yet. Something else that's striking is that the U.S. rhetoric at high levels no longer includes much talk about settlements, which was a big bone of tension in the Obama administration, in the George H.W. Bush administration, even to some degree in the George W. Bush administration. When Mike Pence was in front of the Knesset last week, I believe, he had only one mention of settlers or settlements in his speech, and it was the following quote, which was, "My country's very first settlers also saw themselves as pilgrims sent by Providence to build a new promised land. Under the Obama administration, there would have been language saying the United States does not acknowledge the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlement activity. This is the sort of Mike Pence version of that. It's extremely different. There is one final point which I'll make before turning it over to my colleagues is something else that is making, I think, the whole planet having some struggle to deal with this administration is just a process matter. And process sitting in Ann Arbor perhaps doesn't seem that important, but sitting in the Situation Room, it seems exceedingly important. And one of the difficulties of the U.S. system of government is that we have all of these different agencies that have important stakes in the making of U.S. national security policy, whether it's the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the State Department, USAID, and on. And the White House has to coordinate all of these things at both the working level, the deputy level, the principals level, which is the cabinet officer level, and then the full level of the National Security Council, which is all the cabinet officers, but chaired by the President of the United States. And this has been, shall we say, bumpy at best. You have moments where Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, have been really trying to move the president to a different place. H.R. McMaster, the very talented three-star general who's now the National Security Advisor, has been trying to impose more discipline on the process. Open question whether that will fully succeed. There's a lot to chew on, but I just wanted to put in a plug for the importance of process in all of this. It's very difficult to make this particular type of sausage. Thanks very much.
Well, before you speak, there's empty seats at the front if those of you sitting down at the back can move up. Even if you leave early, you can sit in the front.
Is this on? No. Yeah, it is. Okay. So I'm going to build a bit on what Warren talked about. So I think there's a kind of, you have to hold it right here. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So I think there's a bit of a some cumulativeness here, and I'm going to interpret the mandate pretty broadly, and I want to talk about some trends that are going on region-wide in the Middle East, and how they affect Israel, and how they are affected by the Trump administration's policy, and how that in turn has something to do with Israel. And I want to talk about two things, one of which I'm sure you're familiar with, and that's where we are with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the second item that you probably are familiar with as well are some of the dynamics going on with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Egypt and this new emerging Cold War in the Middle East. Neither of these trends are entirely new. Obviously, Palestine is not new. And the things that are driving them do not have the Trump administration at the center. But what the Trump administration has been doing affects both of these. And of course, they have implications for Israel, and I suppose by extension, Israeli-American or Israeli-American relationships. What we see going on in the West Bank, and to some extent in Israel as well, is an increasing recognition, or at least view, that a two-state solution is no longer an option. It is not entirely off the table. I think the reason that people come back to it frequently is all the other options seem unacceptable, although there's a lot of room for discussion of that. But we know from surveys in Israel that less than half the people support, half the Jewish part of Israeli society support a two-state solution. And even among the 45 or 46% who say they do, there's a lot of variation in terms of what they mean by that. Certainly it's only a minority of that majority that are thinking about going back to the 1967 lines. There have been new surveys in Palestine, or in the West Bank, among Palestinians, and some right after Trump announced the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The numbers there are declining. I've got some of the figures here, but the bottom line is, to quote the Palestine Survey Research Center, with whom we work at the University of Michigan as well, that militancy has risen, support for a two-state solution has declined in the wake of Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In fact, a good friend of mine who was here, leading Palestinian political scientist, who was here earlier this year, and teaches a course with an Israeli every fall at Brandeis, which is how we are able to get him here. He's telling us about how he still supports a two-state solution, but his son thinks he's crazy. His son, who is in his early 20s, thinks he's crazy and says, none of my Palestinian colleagues in their 20s or less think that's an option anymore. So we're really, whether the two-state solution really is dead or not is something to debate. But both the facts on the ground and the thinking of the Trump administration, as Warren described parts of it, do not inspire a lot of hope. As I said before, it's only that the alternatives are so unacceptable, not only for the Palestinians, but for Israel as well. We really don't know what's happening. But certainly the Trump administration statements, other things like cutting support or threatening to cut support for the Palestinian Authority, which is something Israel doesn't want because that authority provides important security cooperation for Israel. And regardless of whether Israelis like it or not, and most Palestinians don't like the authority, they think it's corrupt. There's not a lot of support for Mahmoud Abbas. But be that as it may, this is security cooperation that has worked in Israel's interest, and it depends upon funding from the United States. So we don't know how all this is going to turn out, but we're left with a number of questions, and I'll just mention the 3 or 4 that I think everybody probably knows. One, is a two-state solution really off the table, or can it be revived? Might Trump come in and say, well, I'm now going to tell you the other half of my story. I recognize Jerusalem or East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital, but we certainly don't expect that. So if a two-state solution is dead, what's a one-state solution? And I don't think I'd call it a solution, but what's a one-state solution going to look like? Is it in fact the forced choice that Israelis in the center and the left say that if Israel retains these territories permanently, if Israeli sovereignty is exercised over the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, that they'll either have to give up their Jewish character or their democratic character? There are Israelis who will say that's a false choice, but it seems to me that it's pretty convincing as a dilemma. Certainly it's something that's on the table to talk about. And finally, I guess we might say, as Warren raised, what can we expect from this plan that Jared Kushner or Jason Greenblatt or Trump himself are cooking up? What they've told us is it's going to be about final status issues. It's not going to be a replay of the Oslo Accords, confidence-building measures, gradual withdrawal, a transition. They're planning to put the final status issues on the table. And that's what happened at Camp David in July of 2000. It's hard to think what those final status issues are going to be that could reach agreement. There's also a lot of disagreement about exactly why the Camp David summit of 2000 failed. And is there any reason to think the results would be different this time? So there's a lot on the agenda, and it's not only about the Trump administration. It's not driven by the Trump administration, but the policies of our U.S. administration are exacerbating and encouraging some of these trends and some of the dilemmas that do not seem to have easy answers. So that's the first part. I'm probably have to be wary of my time here. But so the second is just to put on the table for discussion the fact that, as you probably know, there is a Cold War. In fact, it's not entirely cold, shaping up in the Middle East. And on the one hand, you have Iran and Iraq, the country that we set on the course that it's on now, aligned with that. The majority in Lebanon, Syria under Assad on one side. And on the other side, Saudi Arabia, not only Prince bin Salman, but Mohammed bin Zayed of the Emirates is a key player in this as well. The two of them are very good friends with one another, and they are both very good friends with Jared Kushner. Sorry about that. And so we are encouraging this, and maybe in some respects it's perfectly legitimate. There are plenty of reasons to be complaining about Iran. Israel is welcomed into this agenda on the side that the U.S. supports, and that the Emirates and Egypt is a very important part of this player as well. So on the one hand, I mean, Israel has some allies, and there are other countries that are looking for the U.S. and independently and also partly by extension to have Israel as an ally in their camp. But we don't know what the long-term dynamics are that's going to be. They may come out in ways that are favorable to Israel and the U.S., but Russia is more or less on the other side. Turkey is sort of on both sides, or neither side, depending on which issue we're talking about. But it has led to disastrous violations of human rights in Yemen, in which the United States is very deeply involved. We're not the lead, but we're not far behind them in terms of refueling planes and things like that. It is producing instability in Lebanon on Israel's border. It is providing additional support for Hezbollah, which took some losses when they participated in the campaign in Syria. So on the one hand, they're kind of weakened, but on the other hand, they have people who are experienced and battle-hardened, and they are being encouraged and armed by Iran. That has implications for Israel. So country that I'm doing a lot of work in these days is Qatar, which has been blockaded by Saudi Arabia. So when I went there recently, I had to go through Oman. So there's things we don't necessarily know about how this is going to work out, but it's clearly an important dynamic with implications for the region as a whole, many of the individual countries in the region, our own U.S. relationship with the region, and above all, in terms of what we're interested in tonight, is Israel. One last point to mention about this emerging Cold War and the parts of which we pretty much understand and parts of which are uncertain, is that there is a Palestinian dimension. The Emiratis in particular, and Egypt and Saudi Arabia after that, have their own answer to the crisis of leadership in Palestine. They are promoting Mohammed Dahlan, who you may know. He's from Gaza. He was security chief under Fatah in Gaza. He's been in exile in the Emirates for a number of years. It maybe sounds a little bit like inside baseball and something's a little too specific, but he stands for certain tendencies among Palestinians. So I don't know if we can come away with this as we did with the Israel-Palestine with 3 or 4 real clear questions. But it's to say that there are emerging dynamics in which that we are encouraging and in which we are involved, and they portend a lot of uncertainty, including maybe some benefits, but also maybe potentially some costs for Israel.
Thank you, Jeff, for hosting me. It's a delight to be here and with my one of my mentors, Professor Tesler, who was on my dissertation committee just a couple of years ago. I wish. And we'll be,
I wish too.
Yeah, we all wish. And I'll be getting to that a little bit when the student decides to take some of the ideas that she cherishes from her mentors and push back on them a little bit. But first, an anecdote about Jeff's and my time as, you guys call it college here, right, in the States, so in Canada, university. We were at McGill University together with a nice group of young people, undergraduates, college students, and TV was not a cool thing to have in those days. We didn't want to be overly materialistic. It was like the pre-hipster era. But one of us in our group of friends had a TV, which meant that all of us would crowd around it when we had something to watch. So one day, we crowded around it to watch the Oscars. And this was 27 years ago, and it was the first time any of us had participated in an Oscar pool. And the owner of this TV, the host of the Oscar party, had created the Oscar pool. 2 years later, we gathered around the same TV to watch the signing of the Oslo peace agreement between Israel and the PLO being signed on the White House lawn. Now, 27 years later, which is today, the host of those TV gathering parties is about to dust off his tuxedo to attend the Oscars because his film has been nominated for an Academy Award. Now, I take no credit for our mutual friend's phenomenal professional success. But in the second example, when we think about the hosting of the White House signing ceremony of the United States, they have plummeted in any expectations of success that we may have hoped that they would have in being a peace broker. I take no credit for my friend's phenomenal success, but I do think that we are all, to a certain extent, implicated in the successes or failures of the United States and other external actors in brokering justice in the region. And I want to alert you to this fact, or my argument in a specific way, and I want to talk about the concepts and the terms and the policy ideas that we tend to linger on. Some of those are simple terms like peace process. Others are simple terms like Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And others are policy tropes that we hear a lot and that I admit I too say a lot, and that is terms like two-state solution. And what I want to suggest is that the kinds of terms we tend to focus on in policy circles, as scholars, as commentators, may seem quite pragmatic, but they come at an ethical cost. So I'll start with an anecdote that kind of from television. I think this is a Jewish Studies Center, so I think we're freely and liberally allowed to draw on the Jewish Studies sitcom of the century, and that is Transparent. So I think that's an okay thing to do, and it is my favorite show right now, and it kind of touches on the young Palestinians that you were alluding to in terms of their disenchantment with the two-state solution. So in this scene, the young Ali, she's a gender studies graduate student, she's Jewish, and she's making her first trip to Israel and Palestine, and she meets over beers at a Ramallah cafe with a young Palestinian peer of hers and a Palestine solidarity activist, and she asks them, so this wall we cross through, these checkpoints, if a two-state solution were to happen, the wall would come down, right? The checkpoints would be shuttered. Simple question, but they look at each other and they gently chide her, they sort of mock her for her naivete, and they say to her, oh, love, habibti, we'll get to that later, okay? But for now, let's not get to that. Now, they never do get to that. Later, they do get into very intricate discussions for the audience, and for her, the naive audience stand-in, surrogate, and they talk about BDS, and they talk about the Israeli military exploiting LGBTQ Palestinians in terms of blackmail, and we see checkpoints, and we see humiliation, but we never do get back to the two-state solution. But Ali's question was very simple. Would there still be a wall and checkpoints in a two-state scenario? It's a simple question, it has a simple answer. The wall would come down if it were within the nascent state of Palestine, and where it followed the international border, it would remain. But it's only worth answering a question like that over beers in a cafe in Ramallah if you think that the two-state solution is worth talking about. And what are the ethical costs to lingering on these policy tropes? That's what I want to get at today. So when we have a Trump administration right now, and I'm Canadian, so we don't have to do nods to bipartisanship where I'm from, but I appreciate the ecumenical spirit that my colleagues have done. We have a Trump administration that has given Israel, the Netanyahu government, and Israel more broadly, carte blanche. We have the vice president who spoke in the Knesset and was greeted by one of the factions, the Joint List, what's known loosely as the Arab parties, who greeted him in the Knesset by standing with placards of protest and were swiftly ushered out by guards, while largely the Jewish members, not all Jews are part of non-Arab parties, but largely along ethnic lines, applauded the guest. The optics of this spoke volumes. We have settlement expansion proceeding apace. We have recognition of Jerusalem that is more than tone deaf to the facts of the matter in East Jerusalem and the precarity of Palestinian residency there. So what happens when we talk about two-state solution? What happens when we talk about peace process and Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Let me just start with the third of those phrases. Very innocuous phrase. I have used it many, many, many times myself, but I try not to use it anymore. And this is the reason. I've realized more and more that it hides structures of institutionalized power and oppression. As a good IR scholar, political science trained, we didn't really talk about structures of oppression. We talked a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the reason I try not to use that term anymore is for similar reasons that I wouldn't come to America or even in Canada and use the term race relations. Race relations. As long as whites and blacks just get along and are a little nicer to each other, everything will be okay. No, of course not. As many others have said before me, I'm not original in this, the term race relations is deeply problematic because it ignores structures of racism and oppression that go far beyond whether whites and blacks are polite to one another, right? Legacies of slavery, legacies of Jim Crow, practices like police brutality, mass incarceration, and redlining. So those are well-trod areas in contemporary American politics. And I want us as scholars and activists and those of us who have diaspora affiliations to think about similar structures of power and oppression when we think about the landscape of Israel-Palestine. I'd like us to talk more about occupation, equality, and justice. Why do we talk about policy potentialities in the Israeli-Palestinian domain and sometimes never use the word occupation? That, to me, needs to be rectified if we are going to pursue not only pragmatism, but ethics. We talk a lot about the settlements. My colleagues have talked about how that issue has been raised through successive American presidential administrations. We heard John Kerry's speech just a little over a year ago. I think it's time that in US policy analyst circles, among scholars, that we think not only about settlements, which are a huge thorny issue and a very pressing, urgent issue to think about, but that we think not only about settlements and not only about Jerusalem, but also about refugees. And that we think not only about 1967, but about 1948. And that we start to think about what it might mean to honor two cultures, two peoples, in ways that provides equality that radiates out a little bit farther than the picture that is painted by current policy discourse. So I'll just, how much time do I have? 3 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay. I will just conclude by talking about 2 more points. One, is the two-state solution dead? Again, anything's possible. The requisite number of settlers that would be outside the settlement blocks could be uprooted. There would be financial incentives given to them. They could be relocated across the Green Line. Land swaps could be made. Anything's possible, but when we focus on these policy possibilities, what are we enabling Israel, which has the lion's share of the power, to do? We're enabling Israel to think in terms of possible potentialities that involve protracted negotiations that will or will not be US brokered, that enables Israel to rely on its continual trope of no partner. And that's almost become a Hebrew phrase too. That's what you hear when Israelis talk about it in Hebrew. They'll say no partner. So you enable a sort of a foreclosing of more imminent justice and ethical possibilities. And finally, I want us to think about the idea of the models that we use to describe the political realities of the region can be very powerful. And here I want to press in a very friendly way on the model that had a huge impact on me in my writing and my teaching, and that's Professor Tesler's eloquent description of what he called the triangle dilemma. And I looked for the page number, but I was too lazy to go to my home library, so I Googled it, and all I could see was Tesler being cited and Sukharov citing Tesler, and it was sort of like it was getting like quite circular, because it's been a very important thing that I use in my teaching as well, that is, of the 3 following things, Israel must choose 2. It can either be Greater Israel, it can either be a Jewish state, or it can either be a democracy. And that's a very important observation about the dilemma that has been facing Israeli governments for decades, well, especially since acquisition of the West Bank following the 6-Day War, the 67 war. But I want to press down on this a little bit. If we keep describing this dilemma as this is what we see, are we constituting a reality? Are we actually helping to entrench it and bring it about? And so what I want to get at is thinking about what's at stake in the Jewish state debate. What does it mean to be a Jewish state? And what possibilities around 1948, around full equality, around family reunification, refugee entitlement, and refugee justice does it foreclose? So thinking about Trump, and this is what I will close with, maybe, although I am certain that your President Trump had minimal understanding of the implications or even the meaning of the, one state, two state, whatever they want, that he said at that early press conference when he was laying out his policy vision for Israel-Palestine. Whatever they want, one state, two state, did he even understand what he was saying? And maybe there was more insight than he could have ever had imagined. That is, if these so-called solutions are paired with a commitment to rights and equality. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I think what we'll do now is I'll ask maybe a question or two of the panel and have them respond. Then we'll open it up to general questions for responses. So my first question then is thinking about, one of Trump's signature policies, of course, has been America First, and that has meant withdrawal from a bunch of multilateral organizations and multilateral agreements and a devaluing of international collaboration in a variety of forms. And I wonder if you can each respond really in your own ways on if that means that the United States is ceding its role as Middle East negotiator or Middle East mediator to other parties, and if so, what those other parties are and what the roles of those other parties would be. I'm thinking in particular of the Saudis, the United Nations, Russia, or any other players. And if you can respond, maybe on what role you think those other organizations have. Really, who's going to take the place of the United States to serve as a mediator in the Middle East if the United States isn't doing that anymore? So who wants to start, if that's okay? Warren? Mark?
Actually, I want to talk about. Actually, I want to respond to Mira, but
or you can respond to anything
I'll
the
get
others
to
have
that
said as well.
No, I think what she said is really important. I do not disagree with any of it, and it's really maybe helping us to understand by talking about structures of occupation and power dynamics. And these things we don't usually talk about, but they're the context with respect to which we're trying to figure out, is there a way to get away from this? And why the end of occupation, some of us think, maybe all of us, I don't know, is really in Israel's interest as well as doing something for the Palestinians, is liberating Israel from some of these oppressions that we have to assume it doesn't want to be doing. We can have an argument about whether they're necessary or not necessary, whether they're excessive or just as they should be, but certainly it's something Israel doesn't want to be doing. But that is the reality, and I think it's fair to say that most Israelis don't really have much of a sense of how Palestinians live or what Palestinian lives are like. It's not hard to find out. There are plenty of places to look for information. Sometimes it's dismissed as propaganda, and sometimes maybe it is propaganda. But but what Mira's talking about really is important. It's the reality that people in the region live with. And it's the reason that people are looking for an alternative, and that leads us to talk about what might the alternative be. I won't take more time for that right now, but I want to say these are important points. And as you're reflecting on what you think is good for Israel and what you think would be good for the region, as she said, kind of think about, well, what is life like now? If you live behind the barrier in Tel Aviv, you never hear about it and you don't know about it. If I go and talk to them and say, well, you've been brainwashed by a few Palestinian intellectuals. But what she's describing is important to think about. And having said that, you can make up your own mind about what you think about it. I think it's fair to say, I kind of think maybe Warren and Mira will have more to say on this. The Trump administration is abdicating, I think consciously and happily, I guess, America's leadership in much of the world. I mean, pulling out of the Climate Accord Treaty, out of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, these are the reflections, the manifestations of America First. And I think it's going to mean, if this continues, I mean, we don't know how long he'll be in office and how much he'll accomplish after the next election. But if this trend continues, I think we will see a much more resurgent China providing leadership in economic matters, and at least in the Pacific and military matters. In the Middle East, Russia is going to be much more important. It already is important. We wouldn't have had the result we have in Syria today if it hadn't been for Russia. I mean, we still have tons of resources and a lot of things that are going to propel us to the front lines of whatever goes on. But we are moving away from the role that we've traditionally had. And also there's room for discussion about whether that's not a good thing. I mean, Bush talked about a modest or humble foreign policy, and we like that. So there's room for discussion of whether we like it or not. But I think if President can continue, we are going to be in a different position in terms of American leadership.
Sure. So I'll just add one more thing, just on this theme of America First, which is which is the question of sort of how Israel is navigating itself within the context of an administration that's chosen to embrace that particular slogan. America First has a particular meaning in American politics which pre-exists Donald Trump. It was something that he picked back up from the scrap heap of American political history. It was invoked in the 1930s by unilateralists or isolationists, and there's a historiographical argument about exactly how you characterize those folks. But it was an organization called the America First Committee, which was led by Charles Lindbergh, and whose primary policy goal was to keep the United States out of any future war in Europe. Notwithstanding the fact that the problem that was arising in Europe was really rather a large one named Adolf Hitler. There is a speech that Lindbergh gives in Des Moines where he has three particular targets for his ire, people who he believes are not putting America first. And they are, in order, the British, at this point led by Sir Winston Churchill, who most American conservatives think pretty highly of now, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. And it is stated just that bluntly that these are all three groups whose interests do not put America first, and that all right-thinking, right-fearing American patriots would put America first, and therefore would be opposed to U.S. intervention in another calamitous world war in Europe that would cause huge American casualties. Lindbergh's argument was that not only that we didn't have a dog in that fight, but that those who are trying to involve the U.S. in a sequel to the Great War were fundamentally unpatriotic. This is what has been picked up, mainstreamed, and it is, I think, to me and to many historians, startling to see that. It was startling to see President Trump put that phrase in his inaugural address. And it bespeaks not only a comfort with dog whistling and coded language that is still in use, even if there are lots of good-hearted people who voted for the president who do not particularly dwell on that particular historical baggage and think that putting America first is just a perfectly bland and straightforward statement of priorities. There are certainly other people who do understand the meaning and the legacies, and those people are lurking and are, there has been an upsurgence in hate crimes in this country. And it is this type of rhetoric, I think, coming from the President of the United States has consequences. The second point, which I'll make briefly and then hand over to Mira, is that the America First as an ideology is articulated both by this president and by his ideological antecedents, does call for a dramatically shrunken U.S. role in the world. Since 1945, it has been the bipartisan view of a variety of internationally engaged American presidents, both Republican and Democrat, who have made huge mistakes along the way, that the United States, having seen the devastation caused by the rise of fascism in Europe and Asia, was determined to try to prevent it by creating a global liberal order which was rooted in capitalist markets, spreading democracy, and embodied in institutions including the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, which were designed to prevent the rise of the type of chaos and poverty that helped grease the skids that brought the world to catastrophe in the 1930s and 40s. And having the U.S. step away from that even slightly, and I don't think we've at once just leapt backward and annulled all of our alliance commitments, but seeing the way the president has talked about NATO, about the Article 5 commitment that the United States has to come to the aid of its NATO allies, seeing the scorn that he has for the European Union, seeing the scorn that he has for a free press in this country, these are all things that send a type of signal about the type of world that we are comfortable as Americans inhabiting. And this is one of those places where I think the Trump administration is historically fascinating and quite different. And for Israel to decide whether it wants to go along transit for this ride, which may signal a brief departure in American foreign policy and followed by a return to these earlier articulated principles and policies, or this may be the harbinger of something new to come. That's a bet that the Israelis have to place, and they have to work out whether they think Trump is a short transitory phenomenon or the shape of things to come, and that's a very difficult foreign policy bet for them to place.
So I would just add briefly that as the United States retreats in a traditional peacemaking or peace brokering role, what I think we're going to see is the rise of grassroots activism, which is not thinking in terms of brokering, nor does it have the capacity to do that, but it's not thinking in terms of brokering or peace process, it's thinking in terms of pressure. And I'm thinking of the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction movement that I think we're going to see gaining ground. So it's going to move from the White House to the grassroots.
Maybe I'll take one. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open things up to the audience. And the other question I want to ask is really what Mira was alluding to there at the end, which is what action people can take to try to affect change. Those who want to affect change. What concrete actions you think ordinary people can do to try to affect change on the issues. Maybe I'll let you start with that, if you can. Or no one has to.
I wouldn't mind taking that
Okay.
alongside some questions.
All right,
I
so let's
can
take some
lay it all
questions.
Together, but unless you guys have something on this right now.
But I'll take it alongside too.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll
And I'll
take some
keep that.
questions, and I know that
Because it's a good question.
I know that a group of people have to leave to get to anti-Semitism. So a lecture on workshop on anti-Semitism. So we'll take a few questions at once, and then I'll let you all respond. And then we'll do a second round. I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, and respond, and then do another round.
I'd like to hear from Professor Tesler as to your thoughts of how the Israelis view this administration, particularly compared to our prior administration.
So, one thing that you just mentioned, the BDS movement, and when the discussion was about Mike, so one thing you do see is that there are some young American Jews involved in the BDS movement. And then you have Mike Pence going to Israel, and he's going to Israel on behalf of evangelical Christians. So one of the things that I think we might be starting to see is as younger Jews become antagonized by the Israeli government, that the American support for Israel, do you think that we might see sort of a shift in the base of where American support for Israel is coming from, and what might that mean for American policy?
So I remember somebody on this.
So my question is actually quite a departure from that, but I was curious if any of you would speak to the impact of what I perceive as a lack of acknowledgement of the ethnic and race impact, both within Israel and also within the United States. This is very directional. Because very specifically, we're seeing kind of parallel erosions of, if you will, collective illusions that these things had been moved forward. We're seeing it both in the United States and in Israel, and there are parallels, and there's a lot of connectivity now that we're starting to see in everything from Black Lives Matter movements to the idea of intersectionality and challenging our notions of what oppression means, what it looks like, who's doing it, how we each have complicity in it regardless of which groups we belong to. And I'm curious how that's actually impacting, I think its absence is impacting policy decisions and relationship decisions at the government level. And I'm wondering if you see that becoming more important as we move forward, because it's so unacknowledged in both countries, and yet it's very much fundamental to how these different groups of people relate to each other.
So the focus here is on Trump, and my question is, isn't the issue much deeper? The U.S. has de facto let Israel conduct its policy. It's provided blind support in international forums. And Netanyahu is more popular in the U.S. and in the U.S. Congress than he is in Israel or in the Knesset.
And then maybe I'll give you all a chance to respond, and then take another round of questions after. Wants to start? Anybody?
I started last time.
Studies seem to be showing, there's a recent one, and I think it's being touted or discussed by the Jewish Agency, that younger Jews are distancing from Israel. So usually it's the anti-Zionist groups that want to trumpet these studies, but it cuts both ways, because the Jewish Agency has interest to promote funding initiatives, I mean, Birthright being the obvious example, that help solidify and connect solidify attachment between young diaspora Jews and Israel. So I think data seems to show that young diaspora Jews are thinking about Israel in different ways. There's also ways that complicate the other paradigms. I talked about these paradigms that we need complicating. So one important paradigm in my field is exit, voice, or loyalty. So do you sort of vote with your feet? Do you give blind loyalty? Do you abdicate altogether? Do you protest? And we're seeing a complication in those binaries in some of the young Jewish initiatives, like groups like If Not Now, that I'm kind of feeling like I'm pretty old for. I don't really think I have anything to do for them. Like they've got it figured out. They've got the young millennial energy and insight into some of these cross-cutting conversations that you were alluding to about intersectionality. So just on that, so they're trying to press the Jewish community to oppose the occupation, or at least, and to acknowledge its complicity or active support of the occupation. So that's something that we're seeing. So we're seeing young Jews not only distance, but also engage in Israel in more complex ways than in my generation. And then on intersectionality, that's also a strategic tactic we're seeing being deployed across the left. We're seeing a convergence of global and local issues, particularly around race and oppression abroad. Now, whether that ends up being effective is an open question, because what's happening, let's say for Jewish Voice for Peace, they're an anti-Zionist Jewish group, and they have a campaign going on now to try to oppose police exchanges between American policing services and Israeli police and military. And their campaign is trying to draw a link between the concerns of Black Lives Matter and police brutality in America and violence against Palestinians and occupation in Palestine. And what's happening is that link is threatening to many Jews who read it as Zionists or Jews being responsible for Black deaths. Thinking about police brutality. And so the question is, it's a risky strategy, but it's certainly one we're seeing. So I guess I'm acknowledging that it exists, and I'm wondering about the effectiveness, but it's certainly something we're seeing, and I think we will see more of.
So I'll just add, in terms of sort of changing views of the different administrations, I think there's no question that Prime Minister Netanyahu is much happier about President Trump than he was about President Obama. There was sort of a paradox in the Obama years that you had simultaneously the levels of U.S. support for Israel as measured in terms of military aid, some of the creative things that diplomats were able to do together, the cooperation between the security establishments, all of that was, if you spoke to national security professionals, that was at an all-time high. And the chemistry between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu left something to be desired. There was at least one moment where President Obama's aides felt hugely hectored and lectured in the Oval Office by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there was a lot of tension in there, which Michael Oren has dilated upon in his memoir of his time as ambassador. There's something that I think is a consequence of this, is that Pew had, as Mira alluded to, had a survey out in January 23rd, which showed that support for Israel is becoming increasingly partisan and politicized under Trump and Netanyahu and this is not totally new. I don't want anyone to sort of feel like we're shocked to discover gambling going on in this establishment. But there have been long attempts by a series of Israeli governments and by AIPAC to try to ensure that U.S. support for Israel is established on a bipartisan footing. That was put to a really severe test during the Iran deal, when you had a Democratic administration that saw as one of its linchpin foreign policy achievements a deal that the Israelis just hated and still can't stand. The Israeli national security establishment, I think, is in a somewhat different place than the prime minister on it, but it's still quite stark. And you see it, in fact, to your point, sir, you see it in the differing views about Netanyahu, where 52% of Republicans have a favorable impression of Netanyahu. 18% of Democrats have a favorable impression of him. To further complicate this, younger evangelicals are growing less attached to Israel, and my old Washington Post colleague Michelle Borstein had a good story a couple of weeks ago, where there was a poll that was released in December by an evangelical research firm that said that among evangelicals over 65, 76% had a positive impression of Israel. Among evangelicals 18 to 34, it was just 58. So it was really super high for the older evangelicals, still quite high, but several notches lower for the younger ones. And about 30% of evangelicals in the younger group said that they weren't sure what their impression of Israel was. So that's a real shift. And there was a comment in Yediot Achronot from Yoav Frommer of Tel Aviv University, who said, "Don't let the vice president's immaculate hair and white smile blind you. Trump is the old America. Pence is the old America. The more one looks at the breakdown of that support for Israel, the more one sees a troubling trend." So I think that there's been some real chipping and erosion in recent decades.
Mark, your response? Yeah.
So Warren said most of what I want to say about the first question that was asked, and Mira said much of what I want to say about the second. So I'll try to be brief. It's clear that I think the Israelis look at Trump in a very instrumental way. That he's going to do things that the Netanyahu administration wants. I think partly because they view him as uninformed and impulsive, that they can kind of steer him in the direction they want. And so it's more or less positive. It's certainly true, as Warren said, that there was a lot of tension with Obama and that administration. What I want to add to that is that there are trends going on in Israel that pertain to this. Israeli society in general is shifting to the right. The left is increasingly small and more or less isolated. That's maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but not too much. And you'll talk to Israelis, as I think somebody said earlier. You'll hear, well, there's nobody to talk to, and the Palestinians and the territories, they may complain, but they know that they have it better than Arabs in any other country. Of course, this is not true. So this serves Trump's, the direction in which Trump is going is consistent with what a lot of Israelis think. There's still, of course, a debate and divisions in Israel, but it's not as equal as it was a generation ago. And so in that sense, Trump's lead is, even though they don't particularly like him, some of the things we hear in the States, I don't like his personality, some of the offensive things he says, but I like his policies. He seems to be getting support from some sectors of the U.S. for that. I think that's the way Israelis look at him as well. And as I said, it's in the context of larger ongoing trends within Israeli society. I've been having a lot of conversations lately with students about the things that we were asked about and that Mira talked about. And my sample is really just students here at University of Michigan. But we have a large number of Jewish students. We have a large and diverse array, and I see two trends that maybe are some of the specifics underneath the general trend that Mira talked about. One, I've had a lot of conversations lately about what to do with BDS, and students who don't like BDS, who think it's the wrong way to go, but are kind of torn because they want some sort of a vehicle to play a role in helping to press Israel to change its policies vis-a-vis the West Bank, occupied territories, Yehuda Shomron. And so they're kind of struggling, and some of them maybe are finding some of the groups, but I think a lot of them are. There's just, I mean, it's kind of heartfelt. They'll come in and, what do you recommend? Well, I mean, one, you have to make up your own mind what you stand for, and after that, what's the best way to pursue it? But there is this trend. At the same time, and I kind of think maybe that's the more important trend among American Jewish students of the age who would be in school here. But there is another trend, and maybe it's not getting as much attention as it deserves. I seem to have students all over the place that have gone on Birthright, and it's and they're and I asked them, how was it? And two of them, well, we had some good conversations, and I learned from these conversations there's a lot more birthrights than I know. There's sporty birthrights, and there's hiking birthright, and there's all these different birthrights. Which is good. I mean, they should know something about Israel, and it should be a more informed point of view. But I will say, even though this is I'm overgeneralizing here, I do not feel that in general they come back with much of an appreciation of. Of course, I'm giving away my politics here, which is no secret, but of the problems that holding on to the territories poses for peace in the region and for Israeli society itself. I think they come back, I think more often than not, they come back with the view that the sponsors of Birthright want them to have. And so there are strong counter trends along with whatever is maybe the more visible trend of people of young Jewish students who are questioning Israel and maybe thinking about the relationship to it in a different way. And giving up the mic, I want to say that I think maybe we'll come back to Warren's point about what America First means for anti-Semitism, Judaism. That was a tremendously important point that I don't think we should lose.
Okay, maybe I'll see if there's other questions from the audience. Yes, I'll do another round of questions, and then we'll end on that. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are questions.
So, great panel, thank you very much. One of the interesting things that I think was said was, Dr. Bash, you mentioned Israel's instrumental choice of Trump, short-term, long-term. Professor Tesler, you mentioned another that I think is equally instrumental, which is Israel's tie to Saudi Arabia and that clique relative to Iran and its acolytes. How do you see these two playing together, and what are the implications for Israel and Israeli-American relations?
Thank you very much for your talk. It's raised a lot of issues for me to ponder and think about. I don't want to sound like CNN, but what do we know about how these countries use the money we give them? It seems to me we were giving $600 million a year maybe to the Palestinians and 3-point-something billion to Israel. Does the panel know how that money is used? I've heard Israel tends to shore up their military with it. The second point, try to be brief, does anyone on the panel think that demographics, Arab birth rates, are ultimately going to lead to a major change in Israeli position on a two-state solution?
How sustainable is the view that I think Professor Tesler spoke to, and that of an emerging Israel as a besieged fortress, authoritarian in government, if not a quasi-fundamentalist nation? How sustainable is that when you have only 9 countries in the world that voted with Israel on the recent in the recent General Assembly vote, and you have the monopoly of the Orthodox tradition regarding various rituals, birth, marriage, and so forth, and you have the overwhelming, it seems to me, majority, particularly of Jews under 40 in the U.S., that are just disaffected by what's going on.
Okay.
Hi, so I came in sort of towards the end, so I didn't actually catch anything besides the Q&A, but thank you for your answers. So a lot of what the questions and the answers were about touched on sort of social justice, activism, and I'm thinking about around the time of divestment, the resolution on campus last semester. I had a lot of conversations with Jewish Zionist student leaders who expressed that they did feel sort of disenfranchised from a lot of popular social justice movements, and that you kind of, when you enter that, you have to sort of leave your Zionism at the door, that sort of thing. And I think even more than that, something that's truly fascinating and also kind of scary at the same time is that you see something like the departure of the pro-Israel Zionist movement into sometimes far-right, even sometimes alt-right movements of American politics. And I'm thinking about, like, you know, Richard Spencer, who's a neo-Nazi who identifies as a white Zionist, and so who can claim the same sort of Zionism and the problems that that sort of brings up. And yeah, thank you.
I see Mark wants
Yeah,
to take
yeah,
the first stab at that.
Because these were all great questions. If I don't go first, I'll forget what they were. In fact, and I'm not necessarily looking at the right person because I don't remember who asked what. But Israel's relationship with Saudi Arabia and this general connection between Israel and new states in the region. This is not brand new. Israel has been, and American Jews have been working to kind of build some of these relationships quietly for a long time. But I'll mention just one thing. I think there's a lot of opportunity and some potential tension or contradictions that I don't know how they're going to turn out. Shortly after the Oslo Accords were signed, they were in '93. In '94, a friend of mine who runs a research center, an Emirati friend who runs a research center in Abu Dhabi, asked if I would help him organize a panel on Israel at peace with the Arab world. And we talked about some of these things. And we had 2 Americans and 1 Palestinian and 1 Palestinian and one Israeli Arab. And one of the things that came up was, while this is all to be welcomed in a sense, I mean, peace is good in general, and if Israel's under attack, so much the better for Israel in particular. But these are regimes that, for the most part, are loathed by their own population. And America supports them, and that is one of the 2 or 3 major reasons that America is very unpopular in the region. It's not the only reason, but it's well up there on the list. If this is supposed to encourage the Arab world to look differently at Israel, to see it as an ally, someone who wants to make peace with them and engage in mutually beneficial kinds of intercourse, well, they're throwing in their lot with these Arab regimes. So this is going to have some blowback. On the other hand, I mean, for America too, it's not an option. Well, we're going to ignore the Saudi regime or the Egyptian regime, and we're going to have our relationship with the Egyptian people. I mean, that's not an option that makes sense. But there is this tension that, in addition to the Cold War between different regional clusters of actors in the region, there is the ongoing tension in many Arab countries. I think it's fair to say the majority, and I work in this area, where the regimes themselves are very unpopular. And we saw this in the Arab Spring, and there's plenty of other evidence as well. So that's a bit of a, I don't know, caution or challenge that comes with Israel figuring out what its relationship is going to be with Egypt and Saudi Arabia in the context of these regional dynamics I was talking about before, and how it's going to manage those challenges. In terms of money that's spent, just that a very large segment of the money that goes for the Palestinians is in 2 areas. Some of it goes to the UN agencies to support Palestinian refugees, and a large part of it goes to enable the Palestinian Authority to have a viable security apparatus, which, despite lapses here and there, does a fairly good job, and this is in cooperation with Israel. Somebody asked if the demographics are going to change things. They have already changed things, and that's why we are talking about, is it one state, is it two state, in these kinds of issues. And that's been, I mean, I could remember more than a decade ago, in fact, probably closer to 2 decades ago, Israeli analysts were saying, well, the Israeli interests, settlements, infrastructure in the West Bank, and at the time Gaza, it's already irreversible. So the demographic issues are there already, and it just intensifies this question. If Israel continues to maintain these territories, what is going to happen to the Palestinians? Well, maybe more structures of authoritarianism and oppression, but in the larger sense, what's going to happen? I can't remember all the questions. I'll give up the mic in just a second. But BDS on campus. So I probably know some of the American students who were part of the conversations that you're referring to. It's possible that I'm not thinking of the right people. And one of the things that troubled them, they wanted to identify with and do what they can to be part of a movement that is pressing for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank, to grant Palestinians their rights, to think in something that looks like a two-state solution, to really undo, to create a situation in which these structures of oppression can be undone. But they're coming to the conclusion, and maybe fairly, maybe falsely, I don't have enough information to say, that that's not what much of BDS is about. That BDS is about more than that. It's about putting an end to Israel as a Jewish state, as its opposition to the Zionist project. It's not in support. It's not just about the end of occupation. And some of the ways in which this is expressed are anti-Semitic. We don't want to take this out of context. There's tons of Islamophobia on this campus. There's a lot of problems. It's not the only problem. It isn't necessarily the most important problem. But much as some of these people I'm talking to would like to be part of a movement that does what BDS claims to be doing, they're telling me they're not convinced that that's the whole story. One could respond, they're wrong, and I wouldn't know one or the other. But that's part of the conversation that I was part of when we had these events on campus last semester.
On siege mentality, is Israel feeling increasingly embattled? And I wanted to that's what you said? Or will the world see it as increasingly isolated?
How sustainable is, if that's a reality, where you have basically a unified Israel regarding Jews, and then the whole world being opposed to its policies, I guess, except for some of these Sunni Arab countries, and American Jews. How sustainable is that siege fortress in the world?
So the way I see that playing out is that there's two countervailing forces. One is Israel's own sense of increasing isolation, that the whole world is against it, that BDS is trying to bring about the destruction of the country. It's not much different than the old Zionist trope that we used to hear, that the Arabs just want to throw the Jews into the sea, just a different manifestation of that. And with siege mentalities often comes increased hawkishness, less propensity to compromise, less ability to see the needs of the other. So that's on one half. On the other half, what I think we're seeing from movements like BDS, and I know this wasn't your question, but I think it connects to this sense of isolation, what we're seeing is an attempt to shame Israel. Now, shaming works when you are able to connect, when the activist is able to connect with the target, with the identity of the target. And so when corporations are shamed into compliance, tobacco companies, the dynamics of whistleblowers, when countries are shamed into compliance, the US being pressured to ante up in terms of disaster relief, those types of campaigns are effective if they play to the identity, the core collective identity of the target state. BDS doesn't do that because it doesn't speak in the language of Israel's core identity. So there's a reason why you hear it's liberal Zionists, not anti-Zionists. It's liberal Zionists who you'll hear invoking Israel's founding Declaration of Independence to say, come on, Israel, live up to your founding ideals. Anti-Zionists won't do that because they don't buy into the founding ideals that Israel sees itself as being constituted from. They see Israel fundamentally as a settler colonial implant that has a sort of sense of being born in sin, even if they will acknowledge the national liberation aspects of Zionism. So there's a real tension there, and I'm not sure quite how to resolve it, but it's something that I'm watching closely. On Spencer's White Zionism, Richard Spencer's White Zionism. Thanks for that question. That was the biggest gift to the anti-Zionist movement. We saw JVP staffers, one in particular, writing a piece in the Forward, which is an American Jewish publication, saying that Spencer is talking a kernel of truth and that it helps Zionists see their own political ideology in the mirror. Then we saw the editor of the Forward, Jane Eisner, distance herself from that op-ed in a way that newspapers rarely do. Of course, op-eds don't reflect the, well, I don't know, have you ever had to do that?
I have not.
Right, I mean, op-eds represent the opinion of the writer. They don't represent the editorial line of the paper. That's a given. So when the editor of a paper sees fit to write opposing the op-ed, it means that it really struck a nerve. Okay, so that's something. And then a similar debate that you posed, and I thank you for raising that at the back, is that Zionists are now feeling left out of leftist spaces, are feeling left out of protest spaces, anti-Trump spaces, intersectional spaces. And it used to be that it was just right-wing Zionists. So Linda Sarsour, the Palestinian-American Brooklyn-based activist, said, no, I just mean Zionists who won't criticize Israel, so ergo, I guess, right-wing Zionists. They're the ones who should feel the heat, and they're the ones who should check themselves. But now we have a piece written this week by Stephen Salaida, who said, no, all Zionists, and he defines Zionism as a supremacist ideology. He doesn't use the word supremacy, but a reactionary ideology as fundamentally opposed to principles of justice and equality. So I guess it depends on who gets to define Zionism. Do Zionists get to define Zionism, or do Zionist critics get to define Zionism? And this is a big issue we're going to see moving forward. And finally, on demographic questions. This is a big discursive issue that I also think we need to push back on, because we're seeing it play out in very ugly ways in Israel. We see the term demographic threat being used a lot, not necessarily those words in Israel, but for instance, a campaign for a two-state solution, ostensibly for peace, ostensibly for the left, so to speak, run last year by Commanders for Israel's Security, a group that created a campaign. The campaign was billboards across major highways in Israel. The billboards were in Arabic, meaning Israeli Jews would be driving and they would see Arabic language. Uh-oh, they can't read it. They're scared. It's frightening because it's paired with images of hordes of Palestinians. And it says, and then there was an asterisk, in Hebrew, dial 737 for an explanation. So the Israeli motorists would get on their cell phone and they would dial and they would hear, do you care about Israel's security and peace and prosperity? If so, we need a two-state solution now. What does this message send? Arabic is the enemy language. Please don't clip that without any context. Palestinians are the enemy. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinians. 20% of Israeli citizens educate their children in Arabic. Are Palestinians a demographic threat, or are Palestinians part of the area that Israel controls, whether through citizenship or under occupation? And are they going to have to find a way to further the idea of equality? And I'll just close with that, is that what can we do? I think if we talk in terms of equality, new ideas will come on the horizon that may not have been there before.
So I am in the unenviable position of batting cleanup after all of that. And I will just say a few brief things touching on a few of these few things already raised. The first thing is the question of sort of whether a unified Israel can survive in a siege mentality. At the moment that there is a unified Israel, someone please alert the newspapers. It should go on page 1. It is, for all of Israel's problems and for all of its, there are, in a sense, Israel and democracy, in a sense, there are sort of two Israels. There is the one Israel within the 67 lines, which is boisterous, rambunctious democracy with courts that throw their weight around, with legal protections, rule of law, protection of private properties, all of the things, freedom of the press with an asterisk on some military censorship, but all of the things that we by and large associate with good, functioning, robust liberal democracies. The Israel that rules over the West Bank is one that does carry out a military occupation with all of the ugliness and human rights abuses that have gone alongside that and that are richly documented. So it's a somewhat more subtle picture, but the country is wildly quarrelsome, argumentative, divided, and that's in many senses that's actually a good thing and a source of ongoing strength. But I just want to resist that picture of sort of a straight siege mentality, because there's a lot of bickering in that life raft. The question about Richard Spencer and white Zionism, one day I'm going to be dead, and in the moments before I blip out of existence, I'm not going to say, boy, I wish I had spent more time taking seriously the rantings of neo-Nazis. I also will say, someone at some point in our strange era in American politics is going to explain to me the difference, what's neo about neo-Nazis. I would love to hear that. But I don't mean to be dismissive, but I just can't take it seriously, and I don't think that people of goodwill who are trying to solve problems and who are trying to exercise academic rigor to try to think through these very complicated decisions, I don't think anyone does anyone any favors by bringing in the sewer dwellers who don't have any particular rigor on these issues. The question about how the aid gets spent is, in large part, is a function of American involvement as the underwriter of peace processes between Israel and its Arab neighbors. So still the biggest ticket items in terms of U.S. foreign aid are about $3 billion a year going to Israel and about $2 billion a year going to Egypt. And that was instituted by, in the Carter administration and afterwards to underwrite the peace treaty that was hammered out at Camp David. And that has put us in an awkward position in terms of, to some degree, when the Arab Spring rolled around, there was a lot of U.S. aid that had been sloshing around in Hosni Mubarak's pockets, and that was not a moment of great ease for the Obama administration having to navigate that. But that is the bulk of it, and it's a sign of American engagement that when U.S. administrations have decided that they can really chip in ways to stabilize deals that have been cut sometimes with U.S. brokering, as in the case of Camp David, and sometimes cut with where it was sort of a gift that was arriving from Norway, as was the case with Oslo. The U.S. has got into it, and it costs American taxpayers something, and it's legitimate to ask, but I think there's a good national interest case to be made that these are reasonable investments. I'll just conclude with one last thing, and I know we're over time. I think there are lots of people. I think we'll all stick around. I know I see hands, but come get us afterwards. But I'll just say as my last word, something that has been sort of floating throughout the panel is, if not two states, then what? And having worked in the State Department on these issues, I can tell they are complicated, they are brutally difficult, working out the goals is difficult, working out the tactics is difficult. I don't think that you will find very many people in the previous administration in which I served, or in other ones that have been deeply engaged in the peace process, who were theological about the idea of a two-state solution. This is a region with plenty of theologians, and we don't need to import American ones to add to things. The real question for me is, if not two states, then what? You have not one but two polities that are there, that are pre-existent. You have a full-blown nation state with the State of Israel, and you have a pretty well-developed, well-articulated polity with the Palestinian Authority, which is new and which is recent, but polities don't try to pop out of existence, whether they have a monopoly on the use of the means of violence, which is the political science definition of a state, or not. So my question always, for those who are fans of a one-state outcome, I think it's if there is some real way of discussing it that takes into reality the realities on the ground, that's one type of conversation. But I do think that you have to reckon with what these two nationalist movements, as expressed in the government of the State of Israel and in the government of the Palestinian Authority, what are you going to do with them? How are they going to live together? And to me, I agree with Mira that the term peace process can sometimes hide more than it illuminates, and my preferred euphemism for peace process has always been partition negotiations, because it seems to me that fundamentally the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, when it is actually working, is about how you share that one same piece of land and how you find room for two national movements within that one same chunk of territory. And the fact that it's unbelievably difficult is why we are all here this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. Thanks for all of you for coming. And there's still cookies left if anybody wants.